Welcome to the Mental Disorder Podcast. With me today is Awais Aftab. Awais is a psychiatrist and clinical assistant professor of psychiatry at Case Western Reserve University. He writes the Substack newsletter Psychiatry at the Margins, which explores critical, philosophical, and scientific debates in psychiatric practices and the sciences. Awais, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
I really enjoy your Substack, Psychiatry at the Margins. I think it does a great job of talking about what psychiatrists are talking about, which is not always the same as what people in the broader mental health space are talking about. But you talk about those issues in a really sort of philosophically informed way that I think is very rare to come across. So I'm curious about your background. How did you basically end up in psychiatry? And do you have any kind of philosophical training, or did you just pick that up along the way?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that what I talk about and the perspective I express is kind of mainstream in the psychiatric community. But I think psychiatrists who are philosophically informed and who are engaged in these kinds of debate, the Substack does reflect that. So I think it reflects a certain subset of psychiatrists who are interested in these scientific and philosophical issues. I don't have formal philosophy training, but I've had a long-standing interest in philosophy that goes back to my teenage years. I'm from Pakistan originally. That's where I was born and grew up, and I did my medical school. And even before I started medical school, I was really interested in philosophy. And I think in another life, I might have pursued that option professionally, but it wasn't really a viable career path in Pakistan. So I ended up in med school, and in med school, I realized pretty quickly that my interests and my temperament kind of sort of like made psychiatry a suitable option for me, and I didn't really find the rest of medicine that intellectually stimulating or interesting. So from relatively early in med school, I kind of knew that I wanted to be a psychiatrist, and psychiatry was the path for me. And during med school, I kept up with reading about philosophy and sort of like, reading about various kinds of, philosophical issues and debates that concern medicine, psychology, psychiatry, etc. So I kept up with that. And that only increased once I started my psychiatry training and psychiatry residency. And I started reading more, and I discovered this wealth of sort of like literature that has developed over the past 3 decades, in the academic field of philosophy of psychiatry. So I sort of like, I read a lot of that, sort of kind of devoured that. And slowly I started becoming an active participant myself.
Right. Well, the first part of your story is very common, I think, in psychiatry, where there are people who have interest in art or philosophy or literature, but they also want to have a practical career where they can help people or make money. And so many of them end up, going into med school, and they end up in psychiatry. And I think that makes psychiatry quite different than some of the other medical professions, just in terms of the kind of people who might even go in. Now, what sort of issues in a journal or at a conference of philosophical psychiatry would be explored that you wouldn't encounter at, say, a normal, psychiatry conference?
There's a huge range of topics, but it's basically thinking more deeply about the nature of psychiatric concepts and the different ways in which they're subject to disagreement and the sorts of judgments that are involved. And also looking at various aspects of psychiatric practice and the power dynamics that are involved, and how those power dynamics shape our knowledge and understanding of psychopathology. So these are sort of like, I'm talking in general terms about what some of the focus of philosophy of psychiatry meetings and conferences tends to be. So, for example, like on the psychiatric concept side, there's a lot of discussion around the sort of like, the idea of mental illness itself, or sort of like the idea of psychopathology, to what extent sort of like it is something that is, natural and objective, to what extent there are value judgments involved, what sorts of value judgments, what are the different ways in which we try to sort of like, draw a boundary between normality and psychopathology. When we try to sort of like classify conditions within the domain of mental illness and psychopathology? What is guiding that? To what extent is it a socially constructed process? To what extent sort of like these classifications influence sort of like a person's understanding of themselves, and how does that change subsequent classification efforts itself? So it's sort of like the philosopher Ian Hacking came up with the term looping effects that has generated a very rich literature. And there are sort of like questions of, the psychiatric diagnostic constructs. Are these, natural kinds, pragmatic kinds, social kinds, and sort of like, what does that all mean? In recent years, there's been a lot of emphasis on idea of epistemic justice, which relates to knowledge and relates to power dynamics. And in particular, sort of like, there are two subtypes of epistemic justice. One is testimonial sort of like, justice or injustice, which pertains to how credibly we treat the testimony of patients who have been diagnosed with mental illness and what sort of biases involved there. And then hermeneutic justice, which is about, to what extent individuals with mental illness have a say in the processes of knowledge production that relate to psychiatry. So just sort of like, giving some example of the sorts of topics and things that get discussed in this side of things.
And all of these are sort of criticisms of or critical of psychiatry in the sense that psychiatry wants to say, I'm objective, I am scientific, right? And if it can't say it's objective and scientific, it has a hard time saying I deserve the authority that I have, or I deserve the trust and confidence that I have. So I imagine there must be a bit of a dynamic where the people in, I don't know if there's a term for it, but capital P psychiatry or something like that, they want to preserve the authority, the power they have. And so they don't necessarily want the critical people to get too loud or go too far. But at the same time, the critical people often have good points and often attract smart people like yourself. And so they also probably want to loop in some of those criticisms maybe slowly into the broader psychiatry.
There's certainly a dynamic. It's not a purely critical endeavor. I think it really depends on on the person and sort of like how they're presenting the argument and what they're interested in. But I think like there's one aspect of philosophy of psychiatry that is about thinking deeply about concepts and trying to clarify them and trying to understand them in the best way possible. So, for example, when I think about the nature of psychopathology, or when I think about the nature of diagnostic constructs, it's not necessarily a process of criticism where I'm criticizing, existing ways, but rather it is a one of like clarification and trying to sort of like, arrive at, this is the best way to understand these categories. There are others who are sort of like, who are more critical of them and sort of like, might take a more critical stance. So it depends, sort of like, but sort of like, we see all kinds of, I think, kind of dynamics and motivations, when it comes to philosophy of psychiatry.
Got it. And now there is the sort of critical psychiatry movement, and there's also the anti-psychiatry movement. I'm not sure actually which is older or if one evolved out of the other. How exactly are they different, and how much do they overlap?
Yeah, so it's difficult to sort of like give a brief answer because they're both really loaded terms and really problematic terms in their own ways. So I'll sort of like I'll attempt an answer, but sort of like but this is something that could be analyzed in like much more detail, and to some extent I do that in my writings and in my forthcoming work as well. Now, anti-psychiatry is older, relatively speaking, and in general it refers to a set of psychiatric critiques that emerged in the 60s and 70s. And this is the time where we see some of the seminal texts of psychiatric criticism kind of sort of like, they get written and published. So there's Thomas Za's The Myth of Mental Illness. There's Michel Foucault, his History of Psychiatry. There's Erving Goffman's work on asylums. There's R.D. Laing in the UK with his Divided Self and then subsequent writings. And this is also the time where there's a lot of socio-political kind of upheaval taking place. There's the civil rights movement. There's sort of like, much more awareness and activism around LGBTQ issues. So we see sort of like this general societal awareness around various sorts of forms of control and authority and coercion, and then psychiatry and sort of like, to some extent, the rest of the medical system becomes a target of that too. And so this is sort of like, this is the conventional narrative about anti-psychiatry, that, this is sort of like what was going on, and that we had these intellectuals and some of them psychiatrists themselves, like Zaz and R.D. Laing, who were fiercely criticizing the foundations of the discipline and sort of like challenging conventional understanding. And sort of like there were all these broader socio-political links as well. But the story starts getting complicated because some of these seminal figures, they resisted the label of anti-psychiatry and understood it differently. So, for example, like Thomas Zaz never accepted or saw himself as an anti-psychiatrist. R.D. Laing kind of distanced himself from that label as well. And sort of like it gets more complicated because the term has acquired really kind of negative and dismissive connotations now, where to call someone that, you are an anti-psychiatrist or what you're saying is anti-psychiatry has this kind of hostile edge to it, where it's like, I'm dismissing what you're saying. I'm sort of like, I'm saying it's not even worth taking seriously because you're so biased or prejudiced against psychiatry. So it has acquired connotations that are similar to, let's say, if you call someone anti-vaxxer or anti-vaccine, sort of like, in certain circles, anti-psychiatry has that kind of connotations now. So it becomes really challenging, sort of like, that there's this historical aspect to it, there's this philosophical aspect to it, but then there's also sort of like, it's mixed in with these really negative connotations, which makes this kind of tricky to navigate. And so I usually, when I use the term anti-psychiatry, I try to restrict it to that historical kind of setting where I'm talking about, a particular era. But many people these days use the term as a way of referring to this sort of prejudiced on sort of like unnecessarily hostile way of talking about psychiatry. So in that context, sort of like, critical psychiatry kind of emerged as a relatively more kind of academic and respectable sort of version of psychiatric critique. But it's also a very loose term, and sort of like, different people use it in many different ways. It's there definitely, I think it's important to sort of like, have some clarity on how we use that term. I think many people tend to use the term critical psychiatry as an umbrella term for basically all variety of psychiatric critiques. So any sort of like psychiatric critique, it gets called critical psychiatry. But if you look at people who identify as critical psychiatrists, who say that, I am a critical psychiatrist, or they identify that way, it's basically, it originates from a group based in the UK called the Critical Psychiatry Network, with, sort of like, some prominent members being Jonah Moncrief, and Pat Brecken, and sort of like, and some others, sort of like Sami Tamimi. And so sort of like the ideas that they champion and they express, there is a strong continuation with the ideas of the classic anti-psychiatry folks like Zaz, Foucault, sort of like, R.D. Laing, etc. So if you look at people who identify as being critical psychiatrists, there's an intellectual and philosophical continuity between those two movements. And it's also important to, I think, recognize that there are many people who are engaged in the task of psychiatric criticism and psychiatric critique who don't identify as being critical psychiatrists, or who don't really work within that umbrella of critical psychiatry, but they're still doing really good sort of like, psychiatric critical work. And so one of the things, I led a series for Psychiatric Times called Conversations in Critical Psychiatry, in which I spoke with many different people who were engaged in the task of criticizing psychiatry, both from the inside and outside. And one of my sort of like goals was to kind of problematize the notion of critical psychiatry itself by showing the diversity of ways in which this criticism takes place.
That's such a good idea. I mean, and it's true because first of all, within normal psychiatry, there's so much diversity in terms of what people believe. I often find talking to a psychiatrist as well, there's quite a big generational difference based on what experiences people grew up with. Were they in medical school during deinstitutionalization, right, when that was starting? Or was it, when antidepressant usage was surging? I mean, people have all kinds of things that inform their view. So it doesn't surprise me. I mean, my sense from as an outsider of the sort of critical movement is that there are people who are offering these very philosophical kinds of critiques. There are people who are offering more political kinds of critiques. But overall, it's premised, I think, on the idea that something in psychiatry is maybe broken is too strong a word, but maybe the better way to say it is like other, quote unquote, critical theories, psychiatry is not purely objective. That the values, the political conditions, the identities of the people within it are very informative of what ends up coming out of it. And so that then prompts like an inquiry into not only what is being done, but who is doing it, and that sort of thing. Anti-psychiatry, I agree with you, has this negative connotation, which it's very interesting that many of the original anti-psychiatrists themselves did not want to be called that. My perception as part of that reason is maybe because the umbrella is sort of epistemically too big. I mean, when you look at people in the anti-psychiatry community, you'll find people who are doing maybe work similar to yourself, or somebody like Robert Whitaker, who we'll talk about in a second, who is kind of providing trying to do like an evidence-based takedown of psychiatry. But then there's also people under that umbrella who, for example, are part of, say, like hearing voices communities, or there's the neurodiversity movement. I mean, people who are sort of saying, there is no, like, mental illness is not real. It's all socially constructed. And this is just simply another way of life. So, yeah, I see what you mean about it being quite a broad community. And I imagine that a lot of the differences maybe within are, are those kinds of differences discussed and debated within the community, or is it more them versus people on the outside?
I think sort of like in general, I think most people tend to have this sort of monolithic idea of psychiatry as well as kind of, psychiatric critique, whether it's anti-psychiatry or critical psychiatry. But I think, people don't appreciate sort of like, how significant the differences among different types of critics are. And one thing I want to mention is that I think any healthy science and any sort of like, healthy kind of sort of like academic discipline is going to have that element of self-criticism and self-evaluation, because this is how science progresses. This is how sort of like our understanding of anything progresses. So we would expect that sort of like if psychiatry sort of like were sort of like a good scientific discipline, that there would be people within it actively examining sort of like theoretical assumptions and actively examining foundations of the discipline and criticizing and offering alternatives. So that has always been the case. It's like there have been psychiatrists who have always been engaged in that task. And just as sort of like there are people in other disciplines. There are people in physics challenging fundamental assumptions in physics. There are people in biology doing that. There are people in other medical disciplines who are doing that. And I think when we talk about psychiatry versus critical psychiatry or anti-psychiatry or psychiatric critique, we tend to sort of like ignore that like this is a normal scientific process, or like this we would expect sort of like any scientific or medical discipline to have that element of self-critique in it. And I think so that's one aspect of it. And then like some people are the motivations and methods of criticism are very different. Like some people are interested in sort of like, scientific standards and sort of like, or evidence, sort of like rigorous standards of research. And they are criticizing psychiatry sort of like, because they sort of like, they want psychiatry to live up to those sort of like, scientific standards. And there are others who sort of like who don't think that sort of like, psychiatry is or can be a science, and they want psychiatry to give up on the scientific standards and adopt something more humanistic or art based or etc. And then there are others who sort of like who are engaged in a form of kind of mental illness denialism, and they think this is just kind of social deviance or ordinary suffering, and that is just we're kind of unnecessarily using a medical lens. So and then sort of like there are even other people who are engaged in more conspiracy style kind of thinking, and their criticisms are sort of like kind of much more extreme, and so it's sort of like it's a very wide heterogeneous kind of group, and it's really difficult to talk about sort of like like psychiatric critics of psychiatry as if they were just like one entity with with one set of motivations.
Yeah, it reminds me actually a lot of the American conservative movement, in the sense that once you have a movement that is based around dislike or trying to criticize something, then you have everybody gets together who hates that thing, and they all might hate it for different reasons. But as long as they kind of all agree, that this is the problem. Well, one very prominent member of the anti-critical, I'm not sure, but psychiatry community is Robert Whitaker, who is a journalist, and I think he runs the website Mad in America. I've been reading Mad in America for a very long time, including his work. I think he has a lot of interesting stuff to say. However, I think that sometimes they go overboard. And, you had this interesting exchange with him, which you've also written about on your Substack. I'll link to that in the show notes. But basically, to sum it up quickly, an article in March was published in JAMA Psychiatry called Success Rates in Psychiatry, which basically said that psychiatric interventions are rarely reported in peer-reviewed journals, which makes it difficult to evaluate whether psychiatric treatment outcomes have improved over time or not. And the article went on to explain why, it would be a good idea to start uniformly, if possible, reporting the outcomes. And then in Mad in America, they reported on the JAMA Psychiatry article with the headline, "No evidence that psychiatric treatments produce successful outcomes." And the article basically went on to say that we don't have any evidence of psychiatry being better today than in the 1800s. So you wrote a very short article basically responding to their review, where you say that they're sort of mischaracterizing the initial study. Yeah, it's true that there's been a strong lack of data reported. Just based on the lack of that data, that does not prove there's been no improvement in psychiatry in over 200 years. And then Robert Whitaker wrote a very long blog response to your piece, where he dove into his own personal story. He criticized your review of their review. And then he made sort of an argument against progress in psychiatry. And he actually sort of stood you up as being sort of symbolic or of trying to convey this notion of progress, of everything sort of getting a little bit better. We made mistakes, but, is that a good sort of summary of the debate? Is there anything key I'm missing there?
I think that gets the gist of it. The article, in JAMA Psychiatry, which was talking about outcomes, it was talking about outcomes of a particular sort. We have been measuring outcomes. So like anytime we do a randomized control trial of an intervention, we know sort of like, how that intervention does in comparison to placebo. For example, so we can tell that, this many people improved or, remitted sort of like with placebo, this many people improved, but, with that intervention, etc. So we have that sort of outcome data. And then we have different kinds of observational data as well, where people have taken sort of large data sets, and they have sort of looked at, changes in sort of over time. The article was kind of talking about our overall ability to improve the health of population, for example, or our overall ability to sort of produce desirable outcomes. So not just with one intervention, but, so for example, 3 decades ago, we had far fewer antidepressants. Now we have a lot more medications with many different types of mechanisms. So, if we have the same, let's say, if we had comparable groups of people, are we getting, with the sort of combined use of those medications, sort of better outcomes, sort of than we would have, for example, in a similar group of people. So it's talking about a particular kind of sort of outcome data, and again, not just sort of outcome data in general, which we sort of have plenty of those. So one, I think that part wasn't, I think, fully explained or characterized. Another thing was that it wasn't just about that particular quote itself, but um, I have been reading Mad in America for many years as well, and I sometimes say that I kind of have a love-hate relationship with it. I think it served a really important and useful purpose because it is one of the main platforms where critical discussions around psychiatry take place. So it serves an important function. But I think what tends to annoy me at times is that it's basically only interested in a negative coverage of psychiatry, and so and oftentimes sort of like it reports the sort of like results of studies and papers in a sort of like a very negative kind of way. So it gives you sort of like one side of the picture. And if Mad in America is your primary source of information about psychiatry, which for many people it seems to be, then you're getting a very lopsided impression of the current state of psychiatric knowledge. And you sort of like you're just constantly hearing that psychiatry is a failed discipline, psychiatry doesn't measure outcome, there's no evidence that it works, right? And so you're constantly sort of like getting this message without anything to balance it or without anything to sort of like do that. So when I wrote that initial post, I was just trying to show like how different the tone and the message of the original article was, and how different its coverage was in Mad in America, and just trying to sort of like give have readers reflect on that if all you're getting is that coverage and you don't have access to sort of like that the original reporting, then you can imagine over time what sort of impression of psychiatry you would have. So that was kind of my intention, and I think kind of triggered a nerve or sort of like touched the nerve, and I think sort of like Whitaker produced that response, and again sort of like I think that response also wasn't just about my post, but also I think was about psychiatry generally, but also about, I think, sort of like my previous interactions with Mad in America. So I guess there was a sort of like a loaded history behind that whole exchange. But I think it illuminates the kind of dynamics that go into the online information ecosystem around psychiatry, and why I sort of like feel irritated by that, and why I'm using my Substack to sort of like try to promote a more kind of balanced form of criticism that I think has often been lacking.
Yeah, well, one of the things that Robert uses in his criticism of your review is he keeps using the phrase failed paradigm of care. And I think that's actually a really good and maybe interesting, potentially even useful way to look at the criticism they're making broadly, right? And maybe that differentiates the anti in some broader philosophical sense from the critical, is they're basically saying this whole psychiatry thing is like a bad idea. This whole idea that you would fix people's problems by giving them therapy or giving them medication or something and make them happier is just totally divorced from what makes people happy or healthy or that sort of thing. That's obviously a very kind of broad, oversimplified characterization of their position, but I think that is sort of what is coming through here. So my question to you, as the representative for every psychiatrist ever, is if you had to defend against this kind of attack on psychiatry, and you have to defend against the kind of evidence or statistics that Whitaker is providing, where he shows, for example, that I think over the last 30 years, the number of people with mental illnesses has stayed about the same, but the number of people using medications has gone up. The number of people, I think, applying for disability because of mental illness has gone up. There's more 911 calls, more people are homeless and incarcerated, et cetera, for issues relating to mental illness. Do you think that psychiatry is a good answer to that criticism? And the criticism really is, look at how much worse mental illness seems to have gotten. What have you guys really done to stop this? It seems like the more psychiatry we have, the worse all these problems get.
So I think first we have to distinguish between I think different types of criticisms and what I think different critics are kind of alleging, because I think different critics are interested in different kinds of aspects of the current model of care or the current paradigm of care, and what they think are kind of viable alternatives to that. Like Whitaker, for example, is like much more interested in being critical of the medication based kind of way of treating psychiatry. So the way of psychiatry which uses medications as the central method of treating psychiatric distress and suffering, that's his target. And in one of the sort of the thesis for which he kind of gained more prominence in the critical circles was expressed in his book Anatomy of an Epidemic, in which he made the case that psychiatric medications are making mental illness worse. So antidepressants are making depression worse, or antipsychotics are making schizophrenia worse, etc. So that has been his most controversial kind of thesis, and which he sort of often alludes to, which I think others on Mad in America kind of rely on as well. But there's sort of there are other critics who are interested in sort of in related aspects. Other people are sort of interested in, for example, criticizing psychiatric diagnosis, and they think that the use of psychiatric diagnostic systems sort of has worsened sort of mental health and has been sort of a disaster. So sort of and there are other people who are sort of much more kind of interested in other aspects of psychiatric practice. So one is that I think it's really difficult to talk in sort of broad terms without sort of being specific on what it is that we're talking about. Now, a lot of people do talk about sort of mental health sort of over time in aggregate, sort of the society or population, you can say. And I don't find that sort of very convincing or persuasive argument. I think it has superficial appeal, which is why I think it attracts a lot of people. But the issue is that so much has also happened over these last 3 to 4 decades. Sort of look at sort of the sorts of political changes that have happened, sort of the economic policies that have been implemented. And also political and economic policies that have shaped the practice of medicine itself. If someone were to ask me, why do I think sort of that the mental health of people sort of is so much more worse now? Sort of I would say sort of it's because of this widespread social, political, and economic dysfunction, sort of this tremendous economic inequality, sort of this sort of lack of resources available to disadvantaged and impoverished people, the version of capitalism that sort of puts people in this state of chronic stress and exhaustion and demotivation, and that deprives people from sort of access to sources of meaning, etc. Right? So there are all these sort of these really massive social political changes that have happened that have been outside the control of physicians and psychologists. Sort of so we didn't create these social circumstances. We didn't create. So it's obviously the case that sort of the more social dysfunction there is, sort of the more people will be miserable and more people will be unhappy, and more it's sort of it'll provide a fertile ground for the development and worsening of mental illnesses as well. So that's one big factor. Another sort of thing is that there has been a much more awareness and I think acknowledgement and destigmatization of various mental health conditions. People are sort of much more open and willing to talk about sort of feeling depressed, feeling anxious, experiencing obsessions and compulsions, even sort of things like even some forms of psychosis, bipolar disorder. People are much more open to talk about that. Sort of post-traumatic stress disorder and other traumatic reactions, autism. So it's sort of it is to be expected, sort of that. Sort of more awareness, more recognition, and destigmatization would lead to more people adopting sort of like, these frameworks to express themselves and sort of understand themselves. So there's sort of like, the very fact that, remember, like, diagnosis sort of like has been rising by itself doesn't indicate anything nefarious. And also sort of like, the last for decades have been the ones where we have seen this burst of developments of new medications and interventions. And when people are suffering and there's options available to them, sort of like, it is natural that they would kind of utilize those options. So I think that the fact that we are at the population level, our mental health is worsening. I think sort of like is mostly because of factors outside the control of physicians, and I think sort of like trying to sort of like say that, oh, it is what the physicians are doing that is making us collectively sort of like unhealthy is is to my mind sort of like not a very strong argument. I think sort of like it runs into a lot of problems. Now I think there are certain areas where I think psychiatry and medicine has fallen short, and I think there has been this kind of implicit tendency to conceptualize these really complex multi-level problems as being problems of the individual person or being problems of the individual brain. So, for example, the whole like chemical imbalance narrative, for example, that was popularized, and sort of like and associated ideas as well, from like the rise of cognitive behavioral therapy and sort of like the ideas of brain dysfunction, etc. All of them were trying to identify the sources of the problem as within the individual or as belonging to the individual, and the interventions were directed sort of like towards the person themselves. And I think there was a relative neglect of the social, political, and broader sort of like factors that are also really important to mental health. So I think there was this sort of synchrony between the rise in conceptualizing mental health problems as problems internal to the individual, and this rise of kind of neoliberal kind of capitalist kind of sort of like policies which were sort of like simultaneously making living conditions sort of like so much more worse for a lot of people. But I think sort of like there has been sort of like I think a general acknowledgement, I think, in medicine and psychiatry that this social political dimension is really important. So I think so the whole discourse around social determinants of health has picked up a lot of steam, and people are talking about that. But the issue is sort of like is that what can physicians do about it? We don't make the laws, we don't make the policies. In fact, clinicians are increasingly not even in control of the sort of like the forces that are controlling the practice of medicine. Like what gets reimbursed, sort of like how much time do you have to spend with patients, sort of like what sort of rules and bureaucracies you have to follow. Right, so clinicians can talk about it. We can talk about social determinants all we want, but unless the politicians and policymakers actually do something, nothing concrete is going to change. So I think sort of like so medicine and psychiatry and psychology find themselves in this sort of like really kind of terrible dilemma where we are dealing with problems that have a very prominent socio-political dimension, but we are powerless to address the socio-political dimension. We can only address the individual dimension. And so if we don't address the individual dimension, then we are giving up on our kind of responsibility to the person in front of us, sort of like, who is asking for help. And if we do that, if we focus on the individual, then we get charged with this sort of like, the accusation that, oh, you don't care about the socio-political causes, you only care about the individual. So I think, so this is, I think, sort of like a broader societal structural kind of thing that we need reform at multiple levels in our institutions, but it's very difficult for like individual clinicians to do much about it.
Yeah, there's a lot there to unpack, but I think you're right that the level of analysis, right, in any problem is always like the most important thing, right? Is the problem a social problem? Is an individual problem? It's probably an interaction between the two, right? And then how do you deal with that? I have seen in recent years psychiatrists try. I mean, I think psychiatrists, fair to say, actually have always been somewhat politically involved in different capacities and things like that. But I somewhat get worried sometimes about that because I do think that psychiatrists do take this sort of social determinants of health view, which basically says that the not all the problems, but many of the problems people have are due to these broader structural economic factors. And the issue I have with that is, first of all, that is correlational, right? You cannot really prove it, and it's, I think, very hard to. So, for example, if you look at data of long-term longitudinal data of people with mental illness, right? Is it that the poverty causes the mental illness, or is it that mental illness over the long term causes poverty, right? I think these things are very, very hard to disentangle. And part of me gets worried because I think many physicians and psychiatrists are increasingly kind of eyeing public health, right? And basically saying, like, I wish we were more like them. We were more sociology and less just staying in our field. But when I actually look at the effectiveness of those interventions on other kinds of outcomes, whether it's, for example, school nutrition programs to try and or school lunch programs to help kids with nutrition, or not the attacks, but the interventions against food deserts by public health. On many of these things, I just think the approach does not work. Maybe also it has similar problems as any intervention, which is just you have small effects. It's hard to measure things, but I'm a little worried about that in the long term. But I do think that is sort of the direction many people are going in, because they have ideas or concerns similar to the ones you just described.
I'm personally more optimistic about the value of social interventions and policy changes, and and I suspect that I think they can make a tremendous difference in the mental health of individuals. But what I will agree on is that there is a lack of hard and scientific data. It's really difficult to tell that if we were to implement a certain sort of policy, if we were to make certain social changes or political changes, that this sort of effect we will see on mental health, or that the prevalence of psychiatric distress would change by this amount, or we would change psychiatric outcomes by this amount. So that sort of data we don't have. And so right now what we have is a lot of kind of hypothesis and speculative kind of thinking. And I think this speaks to a certain gap in the space of psychiatric critique as well, where we have clinical trials and randomized control trials of medication and psychotherapy, and they have limitations and problems of their own, and critics would kind of analyze those clinical trials to death, saying small effects and biases, blah blah blah. But for the alternatives that they're suggesting, there's even less data. We just, if you wanted to sort of make scientifically informed policy to improve mental health, you have to rely on things that are observational, correlational, and you don't have that sort of randomized, controlled, or otherwise data that provides very robust causal understanding. So this is kind of a challenge, and I think there's a little bit of a double standard there, where when it comes to psychiatric and psychological interventions, we want standards to be really, really high, and we want good effect sizes. But when it comes to socioeconomic changes or policy changes, we just sort of go into this speculative mode and just kind of anything goes, and that's a problem too.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I think is also a bit worrying about that, and I would not say this comes from the anti-psychiatry community, quite the opposite. But so, for example, there's lots of people, some who I've had on this podcast, who are very in favor of reintroducing institutionalization for people with severe mental illnesses on a wide scale. I think there are many, good, sound reasons to do that, but at the same time, I actually don't think there's very good evidence of that, right? Of that being an effective treatment. We can make a strong argument about that as say maybe a good way to have public order or a good way to reduce violence, but it doesn't actually tell us, is that going to make a person better? And so it's much easier to criticize, of course, than it is to actually apply the same standard to yourself. And to your point way back earlier, a huge part of the problem is that a lot of the criticisms are coming at this from so many different directions. There are people who are saying there used to be a true psychiatry science and we've sort of lost that. And then there's other people saying it's all been a fake power play, and they're on the same team going at it from both sides. And how do you even come to a solution from that? I'm not sure, but So it's interesting because I've been thinking recently about writing an article about sort of the future of mental health and where I see it going. And I see really two uh, routes that people across the broader mental health community spectrum, whatever, are taking. And one is more of this community focus. So you focus on social determinants of health, you focus on bringing people together more, reestablishing social bonds and connections. And then another is like more like a biotech individualism, which I think we're also increasingly seeing with apps and wearables. And to some degree, I think you could fit traditional psychiatry into that, although maybe that comes before. But yeah, you sort of have these two directions. And I don't think we're going to have great evidence for either of those things anyway for a long time, because it always seems like the money goes first and the thing comes first and the evidence comes later. So, I mean, how important do you feel evidence is or actually has been in all of these discussions in the political and medical community? Do you feel like the evidence is driving many big decisions, or do you feel like mostly it's used post hoc to justify what people already want to do?
Yeah, I think sort of like, there's a bit of all of these things going on, and I think, sir, I personally have struggled with some of the, I think, ideas and attitudes around evidence-based medicine and sort of like, evidence-based interventions in psychology, because I think in certain circles there's almost this sort of fetishization of randomized controlled trial data, and sort of like, there's this kind of idea that, oh, unless you can do an RCT, then it doesn't really count, and sort of like, and then even in RCTs, unless you can perfectly blind it, and unless you can show a large or sort of like, moderate effect size, then it doesn't really count. And I think sort of like the problem with, I think, medicine and psychiatry, psychology, sort of like, human behavior, is that there's a lot of noise, and sort of like, there's like tremendous kind of variability and sort of like, heterogeneity, and our sort of like our methods of measurement are really crude, and it's just sort of like, there's like so much uncertainty that I think that ideal becomes kind of unrealistic in certain ways. And I think, and if we just focus on that, we miss out on all the other sources of information that we have, which include sort of like, other forms of clinical trials, observational studies, clinical experience, and also sort of like, the experience of individuals in mental illness. Now, I think all of these sources of information have different sort of like different gradations of fallibility and error. So like, so no form of evidence is perfect. They all have different kinds of limitations and different kinds of biases and different kinds of fallibilities. And so my own sort of like preference is to try to triangulate, sort of like, try to see, like, this is what clinical experience and patient experience seems to be telling us. This is what sort of like observational data seems to be telling us. This is what, for example, like basic neuroscience, wherever that is available, seems to be telling us. This is what RCT data is telling us. How do we sort of like, fit it all together? Sort of like, how do we sort of like, sort of like, make a more kind of coherent and complete picture out of that? And I think sort of like, in the current state of psychiatric and psychological science, I think this sort of common sense approach is kind of important. I think we have to be humble about it. Sort of like, we have to recognize that, that our confidence sort of like, in sort of like our state of knowledge is going to be low, that things are going to change, new evidence sort of like would overturn things. So we can't be arrogant. We can't sort of like, we can't present as, oh, like, this is what science says and you can't disagree with that. But so we have to treat it as sort of like, tentative, preliminary, sort of like, incomplete scientific knowledge. But I don't think we should dismiss it. I don't think we should sort of like get to that point where we say that unless we have this adequately powered, perfectly blinded RCT, I'm gonna dismiss everything else. And I think this is sort of like what some psychiatric critics do, is that sort of like, they raise the standards so high that they just sort of like, dismiss everything, and they say nothing works, medications don't work, psychotherapy don't work. And I don't think that's true. I think sort of like, I think sort of like, clinicians do have tools that are sort of like, quite reasonably effective. But I think we have these challenges that I think different interventions work for different people, work to different degrees, and I think we have to personalize sort of like care in a manner that we don't have good scientific guidance for. So we have to sort of like do it in a more kind of clinically intuitive and clinically sort of like commonsensical kind of way.
There's a huge problem, I think, in how everyone talks about degrees of confidence and degrees of effectiveness around science in general, right? And most guilty of this more than anybody is the scientific press, like the people who, the journalists who are science journalists who, will read a press release or read an article and they'll write up about it. And of course, you have public intellectuals and thought leaders and such who, they like maybe try antidepressants and it changes their life. And now they're obviously that should be an anecdote, but it becomes like a broader movement or a broader story. And I think psychiatrists, obviously it's going to be on a personal level. I think from the experiences that I've had and people I've met, I think there are many who are very uncritical sort of believers. And basically if it's published in a top peer reviewed journal, then and it's in the abstract, it says like this medication works, then it works, and that's all they kind of care about, which is probably how many people make their decisions. But at the same time, I do think that if you kind of talk to most psychiatrists, at least in 2023, maybe it wasn't the same 10, 20 years ago, but if you sort of prod them, they'll say, well, it's more of an art than a science. And they'll say, right, like different things work for different people. We have to try a lot of things. There's a lot of room for tinkering and improvement. And we don't totally know how everything works, but we know that we have a general sense. And you're not wrong to say that clinical judgment like that, especially if it's then expressed over many, many years with many, many people all agreeing, that's not valueless, right? That means a lot. And there are many things in life that we don't have a randomized control trial for, but we still believe in and we still do anyway. Part of the worry just comes from feeling like so many people are taking medications. So, why don't we talk about antidepressants, right? So many people, I saw one figure, which was 1 in 8. I've also seen 1 in 10 Americans taking antidepressants. And when one talks to thoughtful psychiatrists such as yourself, the impression is not like, oh, we're 100% sure this is the greatest thing in the world. It's like this might make some, a difference for some people. There's a lot, it's very nitty gritty. And I think part of the concern, and maybe part of the reason for the disproportionate criticism towards psychiatry is just along the lines that these things have become so widely adopted. People are so cavalier about it now. And yet, when we get down to the nitty gritty, it still seems quite, not an open question is maybe too strong, but it seems like there's quite a debate.
There's certainly a debate. There's been this sort of, I think, consensus position in the field that they don't work quite as well as we would like, and they don't work for everyone. But sort of like there's this sort of like the general idea is that they seem to work well for a subset of people, and then for other people they seem to work a little bit sort of like and then there are others for whom they don't work at all, or they might even make things worse for them. So there's sort of like there's this kind of like broad kind of acknowledgement, and I think there's generally pretty good evidence to kind of support that kind of thinking that we have these different kinds of subgroups of sort of like people who are responding to antidepressants. But there is sort of like there is still a kind of persistent and ongoing scientific debates where sort of like people still kind of look sort of and analyze sort of like available clinical trial data in meta-analysis and systematic reviews. And I think it sort of like comes down to sort of like the size of the average improvement over placebo. And I think there's sort of like there are people who think that since the average improvement over placebo is of a small magnitude, sort of like 0.3 sort of like owns the effect size, or 2 Hamilton Depression Rating Scale points, then that doesn't sound that much. So sort of like antidepressants in generally for the average patient are kind of worthless or are not clinically kind of effective. But I think there are a lot of problems with kind of that line of arguments. I think it's superficially appealing, but I think it ignores sort of like, again, the heterogeneity of response. That sort of like, some people respond more, sort of like, some people respond less, and the average kind of values don't capture that variability. I think sort of like another thing is that it misses sort of like the fallible nature of our measurement. And I think sort of like there's a whole sort of like literature on the problems with Hamilton Depression Rating Scale as an instrument, and the ways it does and doesn't capture antidepressant effects. And I personally think Hamilton Depression Rating Scale is a really poor choice of instrument if we are interested in sort of like looking at what antidepressants do. And people who have analyzed sort of like specific symptoms have shown that there's sort of like a much more replicable and more robust effect on depressed mood by itself, and not sort of like the aggregate rating scale score. And then there's also sort of like, I think, this conceptual issue of like what does comparison with placebo mean? We know that compared to no treatment, antidepressants work really well. And sort of like but when we are comparing against placebo, sort of like we get into this challenge of, do we just look at that small difference from placebo, or sort of like or how do we understand that? Sort of like like what are the mechanisms by which placebo sort of like produces benefit, and how do those mechanisms kind of interact with sort of like with antidepressant mechanisms? And if there are overlapping sort of like effects, then we can't just subtract the placebo effect from that antidepressant effect and say that it's only the difference that is due to medication and the rest is all due to placebo. And that's not how sort of like placebo or the medication kind of work. And plus, giving placebo is not an option in the clinic anyway, where sort of like it's between either you prescribe this or you don't. You're not going to give a placebo to a patient. So generalizing from placebo comparison to a clinic setting where the option is between no treatment versus treatment is also kind of different. So I think when you start considering these details, I think sort of like the common narrative kind of falls apart. But I think the bottom line is that these are not magic pills. They don't work for everyone. There's a subset of people who seem to do really well, but sort of like the others who don't sort of like probably don't really need them. And I think it also sort of like, I think, misses the fact that for many people, there are other interventions that can be really helpful, sort of like, lifestyle change, exercise, dietary sort of like, modifications. For, again, not for everyone, but for a subset of patients, those interventions might just be enough to get them out of that state of depression. And there are others for whom, instead of medication, psychotherapy would be sort of like a more suitable choice, if there are psychological conflicts and sort of like, links between their circumstances and sort of like, their internal temperaments and other things. So I think I completely agree that I think this strategy of relying on medication as the treatment for depression or anxiety is, I think it's sort of like, it's wrong, and I think it leads to over treatment. I think what we instead sort of like need to recognize is that we have a variety of different treatment options available, and sort of like, and all of them have kind of sort of like, varying degrees of evidence supporting them. And what we need sort of like to figure out is not to sort of like, pair these sort of like interventions against each other as if, only this works and only this works, but instead try to figure out how to match the right treatment with the right person, and how to figure out how to combine these interventions in a way that sort of like, works best for the patient in front of us. And the sort of like, the clinical trial landscape that we have had so far has not encouraged that, because most clinical trials of medications are being conducted by pharmaceutical companies for FDA approval. And the FDA only cares about comparison with placebo. And sort of like, funding agencies such as National Institute of Mental Health, they have not been that interested in clinical trials. They have been more interested in sort of like, other forms of research. So there's this sort of like big gap where, we have these sort of like, a lot of different kinds of interventions, and we know how they do in isolation against placebo, but we don't know how to combine them or how to systematically use them, or sort of like, or how to attempt this sort of personalization of matching the treatment to the patient. And we sort of like, we sorely need that kind of research to guide us. And so I think we need to I think acknowledge the problem that yes, we shouldn't rely just on medication, and medications don't work on everyone. And I think sort of like, this strategy of just relying on medication as the first line treatment is a really bad option. And we have to think much more broadly across many different types.
Do we have any information about what factors might predict someone's success on an antidepressant versus another kind of like treatment like therapy?
Sort of like, so there are studies sort of like, that have, again, identified various sorts of associations, but sort of like, we haven't gotten to a point where we can use them in the clinical setting and reliably sort of like use them to say, all right, sort of like, for this person in front of me, this medication would work well, or this intervention would work well. So we are not at that point yet, kind of, unfortunately.
Well, it sounds like there's a big gap, like you're saying, and maybe there's a whole area of research which hasn't really been explored, which is sort of how to, in a rigorous way, apply all these different treatments together, separate. It's something I've never actually considered. Awais, it's been great talking to you. If people want to find more about you or read your work, where should they go?
I think at present, I think my Substack newsletter is probably the sort of like, the best sort of like source, because I'm actively writing on that and publish pretty regularly. I have done a lot of interviews and writing for Psychiatric Times as well, in particular for the series Conversations in Critical Psychiatry. So people can look that up. And I also have a professional website where I link to different sort of like videos that are available, lectures, etc., and then other articles that sort of like, people can access. For my academic writings, I think I have a Google Scholar page that people can look up and access articles through that.
Okay, great. I'll put all of that in the show notes. Wonderful. Awais, well, thank you for coming on the Mental Disorder Podcast.
Thank you for having me.